Thank you. So let's begin. And I want to share with you that this is a painting that one of my former student, Sienna, did. And what the painting signifies, those are the students. They are on their way to the future, and they are walking, and they have their cap and gown, and they're actually on the path. And if you um, if I were to show the full picture, the picture shows that the path is paved with the word hope, right? So I think in this moment in higher education, I am a STEM faculty member. I think about what does it mean to cultivate hope, and what does it mean? I'm going to talk about reparative humanism and what that means, and this notion of agreements. It's going to have theory, but I will throughout talk about practically what does this mean, and what does the science tell us. As a scientist who studies the brain, I'm very interested in the science of learning, and what does the science of learning tell us about this current moment. So if I'm gonna go back to 2020. And as I mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm really interested in, among other things, the how we learn and how we learn effectively, the biology of learning, and what are some of the things that can enhance or stifle the learning. And I have been interested in mental well-being, and I have been interested in really what happened in 2020 that we're seeing such a decline in young people's mental health. If we look at 2020, and if you research, if you do a literature meta-analysis search to see what are the factors that emerge in 2020 that impacted us and our students, and by extension their learning, their ability to engage and learn, there are four themes that emerge. We know that prior to the pandemic that there was pre-existing loneliness. The young generation is the first, so typically the people that retire that have the high loneliness. And about 7 years ago, there was a pivot in the data where it is the younger people that are feeling that 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 existential loneliness. So there was pre-existing loneliness combined with, all of a sudden in 2020, because of the isolation, there was no peer support. So there was a theme of isolation. The Because of, we had to suspend our plans, and a lot of young people, a lot of people experience this notion of loss of meaning, loss of purpose, loss of the why. I know that a lot of the interviews that we conducted with students across the United States, asking them, how can we help you with your mental health? They come back and they talk about meaning making. So there was loss of meaning. In addition to that, we experience the loss of routine, and this sitting at home or not being able to go outside. So there was a physiological theme that emerged. And probably the most powerful one was that all of a sudden everything was unpredictable, and loss of autonomy. We just had to, we had to do what we were told. And so that contributed to the uncertainty. So the culmination of these really impacted our students' mental well-being. And I would argue that it continues to. And what happened in 2020, in a way, there was pre-existing trauma, undoubtedly, but in a way, 2020 democratized it, the trauma. We began talking about the trauma. We began talking about the pervasiveness of trauma, and it went from being an individual to, all of a sudden, it was collective. Now, there are many ways to examine trauma, to study trauma. You could look at it sociologically, you could look at it anthropologically, you could look at it from a linguistic point of view. As a neurobiologist, I look at what's happening physiologically, right? And we're going to talk about that. But before I go to talk about the neurobiology, I also want to say that this right here is not just impacting our students and us. What the data shows, and I here want to refer to the research that was conducted by Canadian scholar Jennifer Moss and her team, where they looked at why is it that people are experiencing burnout. And this was published in shortly in 2021, 2020 or 2021. So what is it? And they come up with 6 themes. So I'm going to share these themes with you, and I'm going to, ask you, when I look at these themes, I think which one are resonating with me and which one are showing up in my classes. So number one, people, and they interviewed thousands of people across the world, across different sectors, including education. They said that there's a lot of workload, excessive workload, actual or perceived loss of agency. Again, the lack of meaning related to that previous theme, lack of recognition, lack of fairness, and people felt that the values they were bringing to the institution, to the organization, did not match with what they were asked to do. So a lot of these things, again, were pre-existed the pandemic, but they were really exacerbated during the pandemic. And a lot of these things really impact how we show up, impact us not just psychologically and socially, but very much physiologically. So we know that trauma is a physiological challenge also. It doesn't just, when we experience the traumatic stress, that chronic stress that most people experience during the pandemic, it doesn't just affect us psychologically, it also affects us physiologically. And I want to show you just one piece of evidence here, and I'm happy to share more after. I'm happy to email you more resources and more evidence. But one piece of evidence that underscores this physiological challenge. So in this article, what the scholars who study trauma, they study psychological trauma, what they show is that the part of the brain that deals with our sense of who we are, the sense of self, what makes us we, what makes us, right, our identity, our sense of looking into the future. It's this default mode network, this part of the brain that we refer to it as an autobiographical network, right? it it is very much impacted when we experience psychological trauma, right? Such that the sense of self is impacted, who we are. And this is even here's another research that was done by a group of scientists in Europe that looked at when we sat down and we did the Zoom, that prolonged Zoom, what happened. And consistently with the previous article that I showed is that this prolonged Zoom seems to have impacted our sense of personhood, our sense of, and part of that is the brain. We need each other, right? The brain is very much a social organ. The brain depends on others for our meaning making and survivability and so on. So here, right away, I'm going to say, what does this mean in terms of the classroom? Now, more than ever, our students need to hold on to almost to make the implicit explicit with respect to meaning making, right? So meaning making, what is the purpose of the work that they're doing, and also relationships. And I will say more about that. Right. So this is an example that I want to share with you. We published this. We interviewed students throughout the country, looking at how we could help them with their mental health. This is an example from a student who talked about, they described themselves. They talk about how prior to the pandemic, they were good students. They were able to turn things on time. They were on top of it. Then the pandemic happened and they had to go home. And all of a sudden, the student is really struggling. They're missing all the assignments, the lack of motivation, and staring blankly at their work, right? Now, this is one of many students we interviewed who were really struggling to make sense of what happened, right? And I would argue that this is in 2020 and it lingers. It continues to. Last year, I had a really hard time trying to engage my students. You know, they were always on their phone, they were always behind the computer. And, you know, I had to do an intervention to try to understand first what was going on, right? What was going on. And when you know I had conversations with students, you know, I brought somebody from our CTL to help me. What what was remarkable is how overwhelmingly the students themselves said, "Wait, we don't know what's going on. We don't know why we're having a hard time with motivation and focus and so on." Right? So here the student continues and says, "I was trying to figure out what's wrong with me." Right? Did I lose my cognitive function? So as you could see here, was I always unmotivated and lazy? What you could see here is the student starts blaming themselves, right? And in fact, we know that when the brain is under strong negative emotions, the ones that we experienced during the pandemic and continue to experience for many of us, it defaults to isolation, safe blame, ruminating. And so one of the things I say that it is very important not only that we we teach, we help students, we facilitate, but what is important for learning and what the science shows us, the science of learning is this notion of learning how to learn or becoming self-regulated learners requires some very basic understanding about the biology of learning. Okay? So one of the things I will share with you is that one of the very first activities that I do in all of my classes, my first year students, my senior students, we just had the semester start. One of the first activities that I do with them is an activity about learning about their learning brain and their survival brain. What does it mean when they are in a learning brain? How to recognize when they are in survival brain and how to regulate. And what I could tell you is students overwhelmingly, I've been doing this activity for several years, overwhelmingly they come back and they talk about how, you know, it feels very empowering to learn about how their learning happens and what stifles or enhances their learning. Here's another. This is more recent, where we did a study. We did both a qualitative, quantitative study looking at how are the students doing, and this is a student that we're going to come back to to this quote, but they say that that dealing with trauma, and in this case they were referring to psychological trauma, can feel very isolating. Many of us, they struggle silently, emotional pain. Again, they talk about the loneliness, and it could impact the way they show up, they concentrate, and do well on the exam, right? So we know that the pervasiveness of trauma impacts us not just psychologically, not just uh, socially, but very much physiologically, and that impacts the way we show up, the way we engage, the way we learn, the way we thrive. And also that all of these things are manageable, are the effect of trauma is reversible. And I think now more than ever we have an opportunity to attend to that, attend to those things. So and this is just from anthropologist Rebecca Lester talking about how trauma pushes us to the edge of existence, and this is happening with many of us, and it's happening with many of our students. That trauma is challenging not only the sense of self, but our connections with the materials, and so I mentioned that I had a hard time with the students with my students engaging. And I thought before I could write an email to them and say, put your devices away, you need to be present, this and that. I really wanted to understand what was going on with the connections. I really wanted to understand, you know, their what meaning they were making, what I discovered, what I learned, you know, which is again, it's supported by other data, but what I learned is that they were really struggling with connections, right? Connections with others and also connections with the materials that we were studying. So so now what I want to say is that the current so we have this disconnection that many of our students, and I would say us, are experiencing. And further, I want to argue that the current culture of higher education, it challenges our collective and individual well-being because it's a culture that perpetuates separation. And this is inspired, this work that I'm going to share with you, by the work of Mexican Chicana scholar, Mexican American scholar, Dr. Laura Randon, who has really done incredible work in the field of education, education philosophy. She's written about sensing, feeling, learning. She's written about validation theory. And in 2005, she wrote this really um, remarkable article, Recasting Agreements That Govern Teaching and Learning. She calls it an intellectual and a spiritual framework for transformation. And in the article, she argues that there are these assumptions or agreements, right? These assumptions or agreements that kind of guide the culture of higher education, right? And I teach neurophysiology, and one of the first things we do when we talk about you know, homeostasis and regulation, we talk about themes in physiology. You know that in physiology we talk about the structure and the function, talk about metabolism, we talk about homeostasis, and these themes guide our work in physiology. They are the foundation upon which we do everything else, our research, our teaching, our discoveries. So similarly, in higher education, we have these themes that we work with. And what Laura Randon and what I'll share with you, some of our research argues, is that these themes or these assumptions or these agreements, they really perpetuate a culture of separation that's impacting our health, our ability to repair, our ability to engage, to learn and thrive. So she argues that the dominant belief system is powerful, entrenched, validated, and is constantly rewarded by the social structure that created it. So much so that even when we begin to see that some of the agreements in the belief system are flawed and in need of change, we find it very difficult to challenge them, right? So this was in 2005, and I read the article. I began to work with the article, with my colleagues, to work with the article with my students. And I began to collect qualitative data from students, in my case, in STEM, to see which of the agreements. So she talks about the agreement of separation, the agreements of one way of knowing, the agreement. And then I began to really investigate in 2022, right, is when I started with a colleague and a student writing an article. We wanted to see what are the agreements that still exist in STEM, right? And we published this piece in 2023. What are the agreements that still exist in STEM, and how these agreements, they actually impact our humanity? We go through each one of them. And this is based on, like I said, the focus groups that we've done with students. And those are the agreements that we came up with. So those are unspoken assumptions or agreements that become the norm. You think of them as the norm in higher education, in STEM higher education, that we privilege Eurocentric ways of knowing. We privilege the idea of zero sum or agreement of scarcity and the agreement of objectivity. And what these things do, they show up. They show up in our classes, they show up in our department meetings, they show up in how we do things with our students and with our colleagues, and they impact us. And the result of this, I'll briefly go through these, is that, for example, the students end up fearing ambiguity. They end up privileging the quantitative way of knowing the world over the qualitative, as if one is more superior or better than the other, the superiority of the STEM over the humanities. This may or may not show up in your discipline, but certainly for STEM, this is what was the case. The agreement that seems to impact our students the most is the agreement of scarcity, where it's a culture of competition. It's a culture of perfectionism. We don't really celebrate. I mean, we talk about learning as part of, or failure as part of learning, but we don't really celebrate it, right? It's still looked at as very much, negative. And then there is the agreement of workaholicism. And then this one, the agreement of objectivity, is very much about the Anthropocene, centering the human and compartmentalizing. Doesn't matter what's happening outside. It is very much about you. You come into the classroom, you come into the department, you come in, and you are expected to leave everything behind. So here is an example of a student that is representative of other students who you could almost hear in their response that they're feeling the disenchantment that higher education expects us to leave everything behind, and the student talks about both the professors and the students themselves, even though that their lives are filled with emotions and emotional events that represent them, right? So in the article, what we argue that, um, this is in 2023, we argue that these agreements would shape how we show up, how I show up as a professor, how I show up as a researcher, how I show up as a mentor, as a coach. Um, and then it guides my work. And by extension, it impacts the students. And so I grew up in that culture of the scarcity, and then I perpetuate that scarcity. And in this moment, more than ever, we need different agreements. We need different agreements that guide our teaching and learning if we are going to entertain the possibilities of repair, of addressing trauma, and so on, right? So this is another quote from a student even prior to the pandemic, who talks about how they really wish that their environment, again, this is a STEM student who, is looking for more empathy. And they go on and they say empathy is really important. It makes a happier student. And they say that they wish their professor, their teacher, they say things like, I understand, before they give them the failing grade. And many of the students, overwhelmingly, it doesn't matter which part of the country, which year they were, overwhelmingly, when we interviewed them, they talk about how they want to be seen. They don't want to be a number. They don't, some of the students said, we don't want to be viewed as our student ID, right? And so it goes back to how trauma impacts our sense of self, it impacts the relational, and it seems that the repair from that is very much in the relational as well. All right, so I will just give you an example of what the agreement, for me, that seems to really impact me the most, and then I want to pivot and talk about what can we do about it, right? What does it mean when I'm saying we need new agreements? What does it mean practically speaking? So I know that the agreement that seems to impact me most is and show up in my work and guide my work is this agreement of scarcity. I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time to cover the material, and so I'm going to cram more, and so on and so on. So I began to reflect on seeing how this is not sustainable, seeing how not only it's not sustainable, these agreements, but they don't align with the science of learning, right? So I began to reflect on what harm am I inflicting on my students through my pedagogy, right? And I just want to share with you, a story related to how often um, I feel I feel like I have a lot of content to cover because I teach courses that are content heavy, and how often I think about the science of learning and how when we process sensory information, whether it is physiology or whether it is philosophy or um, what is happening is sensory information is coming into the brain and it's being filtered and processed in the brain, and that's coming at a certain speed. And that speed was not matching the speed with which I was throwing information at my students. So I know I was inundating them with content. And in the Journal of Life Science Education, there was an article several years ago that was published that was and the title of the article is the tyranny of content, and how that overwhelming students with content was what it was doing is it was really hindering their learning, right? So I decided to turn to my students and ask them, what does it feel um, when we experience that content heavy, when a professor throws a lot of content at you? And I asked them to vote in a Mentimeter. And then what I did is I had them turn to each other and talk about what they voted, and then they had to vote again. Okay. And so I asked them to put one word, and I, just want to invite you to put in the chat. I'm unable to read the chat right now, but just to put into the chat what you think what you think students came back and said, right? And I'll just give you a few seconds, and then I'll share with you what students in that particular class came back and said.
So we got disengaged, we got lost,
Disengaged and
overwhelmed,
overwhelmed.
alienated,
Mm-hmm,
confused, overwhelming,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
anxious,
Anxious.
lots of overwhelmed.
Lots of overwhelmed. Yes, and
Mm.
I can tell you that I
Bored.
myself bored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting word actually, and some of the students talked about boredom. Um, so
Ex-
so yeah.
There's more coming, Prof. Imad.
Yeah, yeah, good, good. What I could tell you is I would be sitting preparing for my class. You know, this is a physiology class. I had a pathophysiology class, and I would just feel, I could feel, in fact, sometimes I could feel sick. Definitely, I feel the tension. And because I had 100 and some slides to cover, but I only had 75 minutes, right? And I felt like I didn't have enough time and I had to cover this much. And so all I was saying was like just speaking fast, speaking fast, speaking fast. And I could tell, the body language of the students. So this is what the students come back and say. Oops, sorry, right here. This is what the students come back and say, that they were feeling overwhelmed, they were feeling scared, because so much depended on them learning that material so they could pass the exam, so they could apply to the next thing. And when I saw this, they challenge, anxious. I couldn't find curious. I mean, that's I suppose is a positive thing. But when I saw this immediately, I thought, this does not align with the neurobiology of learning, right? It is neurobiologically, I won't say impossible, that's a big word, but very, very difficult, neurobiologically very difficult to meaningfully learn and retain the information when we are in a state of that strong negative emotions, when we don't feel safe, when we don't feel connected, when we feel overwhelmed, right? The brain is going to move from that learning brain to that survival brain. And so I began to really examine what is it, about my practice in the classroom that perpetuates the agreements, in this case, agreements of falsity, and how is it impacting our students, right? So we talked about the sense of self, and we talked about how trauma impacts the sense of self. And my mentor and colleague um, from South Africa, from Stellenbosch University, Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, has written a lot about what does it mean to break cycles of trauma. We know that trauma begets trauma. Now, in this question, what does it mean to be human in the aftermath of mass violence, mass trauma and violence? I understand she's asking it in the context of South Africa, but we could take this question and apply it anywhere. And I have taken it and been working on what does it mean to be human in higher education, to be able to thrive, to grow in the midst of very real psychological trauma, I would say individual and collective, right? And what Pumla argues is that when we've experienced historical trauma, she turns to restoring the human bond. Why is that? Because trauma, as I said, even from a physiological perspective, trauma impacts our sense of connection, our sense of connection with ourselves, our sense of self, our sense of connections with others. And so she talks about that we need something new. And she calls that reparative humanism, right? Reparative humanism, she says that really it's a new ethics of care, and that can help us transform our society. So here I just briefly define reparative humanism as a philosophy that takes humanistic principles of dignity and the right and the rightful presence of every person to start to bring repair and healing, right? That were caused by systems that harmed. And so, what does it mean to bring in those principles, to enact, to engender new agreements? And what does it mean, practically speaking, on a day to day basis, right? Okay, so grounding our teaching and learning agreement in reparative humanism. What Laura Randon says, going back to the very initial article, she says that whatever agreements we have, these become our dream field. She calls it pedagogical dream field. And she invites us to dream different dreams. And instead of an agreement that is very much a monolithic way of knowing. She says we privilege logic and intellectual over intuitive knowing, she says, come up with new agreements. And in fact, she says these are the very basic. I understand transformation is a big deal, but she says these are the very basic beginning steps of transformation. What are the agreements that you're privileging? I told you that in my case it was the scarcity. And how is it and why is it being privileged, right? And how is it impacting your ability to show up fully and the students' ability to show up fully and engage and explore choices? And then she says, recast the agreements, right? So now what I want to do, I want to share with you some practical. And every article that I'm going to share, I will share it with you. I will share the PDF. So I wrote this article. I wrote a column every month for the teaching professor. And in these columns, what I do is I bring in the science. What does the science tell us about X? I look at the research, the teaching and learning, scholarship of teaching and learning. What do we know about that? X also. And then I say, all right, practically speaking, what do we do about it? And I give some very practical, do this in the classroom, do that in the classroom. So in this article, what I did, I talked about how can we, practically speaking, reduce the content so we don't inundate the students, right? Without compromising the, the challenge, the academic challenge. Why? Because challenging students academically is really important for repair from trauma. It's really important for rebuilding that sense of self, right? So when you look at the literature on trauma-informed care, nowhere in there does it say reduce the rigor, right? And so here I get very practical as a what I did to start getting rid of some contents and go deeper into the content that I'm keeping. So what I was focusing more how to make my students more sophisticated in their learning. So here's an example. Another example is I talk about, specifically, I talk about the agreement of what does it mean to work with an agreement of teaching through a disability lens, right? A disability lens, or you could think of it as a universal learning lens, right? Universal design for learning. How can I design my syllabi, my courses, my interaction with the students in a way that works for everyone? The universal. So in this case, we focus on, focus on how to design my courses that accommodate the mental distress that our students are coming with. How can we help them actually develop tools to better cope so they could continue to learn and thrive? For example, I talk about how in some of the interviews that we did, a lot of students talked about grief and sadness and sorrow. And I say, what does it mean to, in a practical sense, to cultivate within our curricula? I teach science. It's very easy for me to say, I don't want to do sorrow and kindness, and right, but it's also very crucial for students learning, for them to have that holistic experience. Um, and then a more recent one, actually, that I wrote is about what does it mean to move from an agreement that centered the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene, right? What does it mean to help students take what they learn in my class and make connection with the outside world, make connection with nature, make connection with, I say the Symbiocene, okay? So we, in the article, we propose different agreements, and then we give very practical, I think like 3 examples under each, that move from a Eurocentric only way of knowing to a more pluralistic, from an agreement of scarcity to abundance and multiplicity, which helps with sustainability, and then move from that, objectivity, the Anthropocene, to a more one that centers the Symbiocene, the nature, humanity, and the world.
Hi, Prof. Thank you very much for sharing. And quite early in the beginning, you spoke about students having a survival brain versus a learning brain. Do you have an example of how one can move or shift between those two, or are you still getting to that?
Yes, yes. So really important question. So it begins with helping them learn about that. So in my writing, I talk about teach to empower through knowledge. So it can't just be the professor who's going to, it also, we need to help the students learn about when they are in that learning brain or that survival brain. And then what I do with the students, I help them, we all in the classroom, we come up with a coping plan, right? And the coping plan involves like really step by step. When do you think you are, when do you know when you are in survival brain? Write it down. and they say they write very, very insightful. So I want them to pay attention to it. And then, the next question is, asking yourself, is this an imminent threat? Because we go into that survival brain when the brain thinks it's an imminent threat, not a chemistry exam, right? And then they answer that, and then what are some of the tools you can seek? What are some of the tools who are the people that you can to help you shift from that survival to learning? We talk about the process of regulation and co-regulation, that when the nervous system is under the influence of those strong negative emotions, sometimes it becomes really difficult to regulate itself. But I could turn to somebody, my classmates, my teachers, my counselors, and so on. So we have these plans. So, I wrote an article practically about how to do, and what we do, and what I do in that article, I say, help the students come up with a coping plan, and then have the students talk about it, share the coping plan with each other. So those are some of the things I do, and they get very engaged in it, and they learn from each other. I've learned from them. I've taken some of their suggestion, and I thought, I should apply that too. Yeah.
Thank you very
Does that
much.
help?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. Prof. Grayson, please go ahead.
Presentation.
Hello.
I found that incredibly insightful. I want to ask you actually about the university teachers, though, because I mean, obviously, everything you've said applies to us as much as to the students. And I'm wondering, if we as teachers are experiencing a period of trauma ourselves and
Mm,
are struggling to do the
mm,
things you're saying the students are struggling to do, to feel, like we don't have to deal with molasses in our brain,
mm.
to feel with complete cognitive slowdown, if not shutdown. I mean, do you have any suggestions for the teaching staff?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So, notice I use language of us, and our students, because this is not just the students. You're spot on that a lot of us are experiencing that. And I had a mentor who would say, you can't give what you don't have. And so if we're not regulated, if we're not paying attention to our well-being, to our repair, it's going to be very difficult to do that, and to do it in a sustainable way for our students. And what I want to underscore is that, you know, it's an energy problem, right? And I just briefly looked at the chat and I saw the word depleted. When we are experiencing that overwhelm, the brain, the body is going to try to resolve it, and it's putting a lot of energy. And when we continue to feel overwhelmed, the attacks, the stress, and so on, we could reach a point where we feel energy depleted. And so this is you could think of it as a sensory overload, where it's really easy for us to feel the overwhelm, the right. And so I think it's very, very important to pay attention to our own well-being. What does it mean to, for example, I shared with Tamsin previously that I tell the students to come up with a coping plan, and I have to come up with a coping plan. And for me, practically speaking, I was recognizing that I was feeling depleted, that I was feeling that how easily it is for me to feel overwhelmed, the workload, and so on. And I had to, say, okay, what is the opposite of sensory overload? Hmm, there's like I need to reduce some of that sensory overload. I'm very judicious with which committees I say yes to. I'm very judicious with like how much I put on my plate. And just so there is that. It's really important for me to have some kind of circle around me, friends, two people where I could turn to, especially when I'm feeling especially depleted, and try to how, like, in fact, I say to them, can you remind me why I do this? Sometimes I say, because when we are under that overwhelming stress, the sense of purpose, the sense of meaning becomes really challenged. Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, I learned to be a human from other human beings. And I think it's remarkable because when our sense of self is overwhelmed, is shattered, it's going to be very difficult for me alone to reclaim that. So we turn to others. So community, coping plan, reduce what's on your plate, and pay attention to your own, your own humanity, your own dignity, your own well-being, so we can show up for our students and help them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thanks, Prof. Grayson. There's lots of comments coming through in the chat space as well. But I don't know if there's any other questions or thoughts, comments. One of the things I have, Prof, is this work, the other work, the human work that you're doing. You still have that load with the curriculum. And so where do you fit these aspects? How are they embedded in your classes?
I tie it to the, I say I'm lucky, and maybe I'm not lucky, but I am lucky that I teach sciences, that I teach physiology, and so I always find a way to connect these things to what we're learning in the class.
Okay.
But let's say I taught philosophy, or let's say I taught, I don't know, a class that is not science, history. I could also find a way to tie it to the class by tying it to how we learn and how we learn effectively, and why you should care about this topic and meaning making and so on. So what I do is, I don't take an entire class to talk about this, but I have throughout the semester, these things show up in bits and pieces. And these things, they also help me kind of relax because as what I see students relax. Like we did an activity with my senior students, fourth year, about regulating the anxious brain, and I tied it to learning. And a lot of them were like, "Oh, I wish I knew this my first year," right? I wish I knew this my first year. But you as a teacher, you feel so validated that the students are, you're trying to get them engaged, and all of a sudden they feel so engaged. And so it's I do it throughout. I do it in bits and pieces, and I tie it to learning how to learn effectively. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Any other questions?
I'm looking at the chat, and I see two points. I want to how do we help our colleagues get on board? I think we meet them where they are. People are struggling, and I always think, and when I use this, I suppose this mantra is like, people are trying their best. Are they? I don't know, but I'm just going to say they're trying their best. They're doing what it helps me. I meet them where they are, and I give them the science when they want to engage, right? And I also want to say that these are really difficult times. There are global famines, there is genocide happening, they affect us, they affect our students. My students are constantly scrolling, I don't know, like scrolling. And I talk about, for example, how the brain, it wants us to stay alive. And so it tends to ruminate on the negative. It catastrophizes all of these things, and all of these things impact how we engage with learning. And so some of the students, in fact, they say, we want to become self-regulated learners. We don't know how. We give them tools, right? We have conversations, we talk with them, and I would say with ourselves as well.
Thanks so much for that. We have one more question. Abdul, go ahead.
Hi, Prof. Thanks so much for a very interesting conversation. Just based on what you said now about the self-regulated learner and equipping students with tools, what in your experience has been the most effective or impactful tool that students have found quite useful for? You spoke about the survival and the learning brain. What in your experience has been the tool that has made the most impact on students and their own, learning how to learn journey?
This is very practical. There
Yeah,
is a video on YouTube, and it's like a less than 5 minute video, and the video is called The Learning Brain versus the Survival Brain. I
right.
play it on the first day of class, and then I have like it's a very short activity. You could
Yeah,
do it in any class.
yeah,
I play this video, and then I give them a set of questions. Do you identify with the video? 100% students will say yes.
right.
And then they're like, I wish we knew, whatever. And then I say, okay, how do we shift from, and in the video he gives you some practical things. He says,
Right.
to move from the survival to the learning, we need to pay attention to connections and attachment. And I say, practically speaking, what does this mean for you? Give me 3 things. They write them down, and I say, share them with each other. They share them with each other. So I've been doing this activity for several years. It has been the most students, in fact, students will, I have a reputation, like they go outside and they say, oh, you're going to learn about this.
Yeah.
So you could find it on YouTube. You could put it in your class. It really goes a long way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. That's very useful.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much, Prof. Any last question?
Rita, if I may.
Fatima, please
Prof,
come.
I just wanted to ask, so what's interesting is that you've embedded all these approaches in your curriculum. It's not a standalone, it's really embedded in your subject matter, right? And
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just a comment about that. So what's the uptake been throughout other faculties at the institution of this approach? And the reason why I ask that, we're often faced with the issue about sort of moving the needle for student success. We've got to adopt approaches that have been empirically proven. And I know you have the science behind that, but just some comment on the work that's been done thus far in terms of students.
Yeah. So I can tell you, so especially at my previous institution, we really had a hard time with enrollment, and enrollment is very multifactorial. It's not one reason, and we had a hard time with retention. And when I started, and I didn't do it so I could see what was going to happen, but I have 100% retention in my classes. And if you look at my exams and if you talk with my students or look at my student evaluation, one of the most recurrent feedback I get is the class is very difficult. She's very difficult. Her exams are difficult. So I know I'm not like the students are not getting easy A's. It's very, those classes are very difficult, but I give them the tools, right? And part of those tools are those emotional, look, the emotions act as a gateway for learning. They can enhance the learning or stifle the learning.
Sure.
And so I empower them with the knowledge. And I could tell you, I am an N of one, just one person, but for several years, my retention was 100%, right? Does that translate to the, and when my students go to the next class or they are successful, I keep very good track of that. Is it scalable? I'm not sure. I haven't done that, but I could tell you I follow the science. I believe in the science, and these practices are very aligned with the science and aligned with some of the scholarships of teaching and learning.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you.
Yeah.
So do you want to bring, sorry, Prof, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to put my email in the chat, and I want to invite anyone, if you have any questions, to please reach out. Like I said, I'm going to give the presentation, the copy of the presentation and the articles, and the very end of the presentation, it has examples that may or may not work for you. Like, so I add more practical examples.
Thank you.
Fatima, is there anything you want to draw from the chat?
Sure, I'm just scrolling through here. Just, a host of comments where, suggesting that everything that Prof has said is resonating with people. I think the issue about self-care for faculty, as Prof Grayson pointed out, is a big thing here, certainly coming up. And yeah, I think we've covered everything there. Perhaps, Prof, I just want to add, I remember Prof Laura Rendon spoke at our Siepo Marela conference, and something that she always what stuck in my mind was she drew this comparison between, the narratives that we faced with and the need to change them. And one was the Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And then she contrasted that with Advilo, I feel, therefore I'm free. And that was sort of very powerful, in sort of and navigating the challenges in learning and teaching and the transformation of self too. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fatima. I think, given the time, and we could go on listening to you for longer, Prof. Imad, but I guess we'd have come to a close of the session because of other speakers waiting as well. But we want to extend an absolute thanks again to you, to the conversations, and especially those practical examples, and to the opportunities that we now have where we can challenge our own assumptions back in the class, the way we approach our teaching, the way we approach our way of being in higher education as well, and how we can take this forward. Prof. Grayson wanted to say something. Please go ahead, Prof. Grayson.
No, sorry, just thank you. This was brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, I think we have overwhelming sense of emotion to show our appreciation to you. We wish it was in person, but we hope you feel it.
Thank you very much. I do feel it. I do. I'm really grateful, and I honor your heart. And I wish you lots of healing and repair, you and your students and your communities and your beloveds. So thank you very much.
And we hope to see you when you're in South Africa again. I know you come to Africa often, so I hope when you come out here, you'd visit us a bit.
Yes,
so,
inshallah.
Abdul, do you still have something to say? You wanted to say something?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, so I think Fatima, okay, we draw to a close. Thank you so much again, Prof. Imad, and we wish you the best of days further and the best of your time as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.